Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. You may recall talking about feudalism when we covered ancient Japan with the shoguns and the daimyos and the samurai and all of that. This is going to be feudalism in the context of medieval Europe, and we will talk about how that system looked and what life was like at that time for people who lived within the feudal system. So by the time we've come to the end of this video, you should be able to define feudalism and explain why it's important in medieval society. You should be able to explain what the relationship is between the various classes in a feudal system, and we'll talk about that in great detail. You should also be able to describe the role of women in medieval society, and not only women, but also of peasants and other classes within feudal society. So the feudal hierarchy exists within what's called a manor. And a manor is the name that's given to a lord or a nobleman's estate. It could be just a small plot of land, or it could be hundreds or maybe even thousands of square miles, depending on the lord. But the structure, the hierarchy on a manor remained basically the same regardless of the size of that manor. And feudalism is the name of that social hierarchy. That's a system where lords give land to the people who are below them, and in return they get things like loyalty and service. So what you see there on the right is a graphic organizer, and I know it's not the clearest, but this gives you a very good idea of what is exchanged between the classes in a feudal system. So at the very top there you have the king, and the king will give land to his lords or his noblemen, and in return the lord must give the king loyalty and military aid whenever the king needs the military for a war, for example. The lords then give land to the knights, and the knights we'll talk about in a minute. They're the military on a feudal system, and they will give them like food and shelter and protection, and in return the knights have to give the lords, again, honor and loyalty as well as military service whenever they need it. Then the knights will give some land to the peasants, which is the lowest class of people, and they will also give them food and shelter and protection. And in return, the peasants have to farm the land and make payments to the lords as it's needed. So you can see there's a very, very detailed hierarchy of how the feudal system actually works. Someone in the upper class gives the person below them food, shelter, protection, maybe land, and in return they get loyalty and military service from those people they have provided that food and shelter to. And that land that they give to the people below them is known as a fief or an estate. And again, just like what the king gives to the lord, it could be a very small piece of land or it could be a very large piece of land. Now, kings and lords received their titles from inheritance typically. If a father died, he passed his land or his fief on to his son. The knight class, however, is a group of people that is trained. Boys who were born into nobility, into a noble family, were often trained from a very young age to become knights. They were trained in this military way of life. The reason for this is there was a lot of war, especially in the early Middle Ages, before, say, the year 1000 or so. Lords frequently fought each other for each other's land. So all these manors, all of these estates, these fiefs, needed a large number of soldiers, knights, to protect that land and fight for it if need be. Now, as the years wore on, the estate system became a little more stable. There was less fighting between families, between estates for land. So you don't have as many wars, and so knights aren't needed as often to fight. So what they did is develop things called tournaments, which is a very popular way for knights to show their skills, and people could come and the knights could show off for the spectators that were there. This is what you would see today at, say, a Renaissance fair, the jousting tournaments and the sword fighting and things like that. And throughout their lives, knights were expected to abide by an honor code that was known as chivalry. And chivalry pledged or preached obedience, honor, courage, things of that nature. One example would be, if you're going to fight an opposing knight, the code of chivalry dictated you allow him to defend himself, like get his armor on before you attack him. that kind of thing, to ensure that the kill was done, or the fight was done with honor. Now, this did not extend to peasants. The code of chivalry existed only among the nobility, but it was a very, very important, crucial component of the knight's life. The center of a manor in medieval society was the castle. Castles evolved over time as building, engineering, as it were, became more advanced. Early castles were usually wooden, surrounded by a moat, which is sort of a waterway that you could, according to stereotype, throw gators in to keep people from crossing and all of that. As the years wore on, castles became much larger. They became much stronger. They were usually made of stone instead of wood because it was easier to defend. It was much harder to penetrate if you are an invading force if the castle is made of stone. And these castles were almost like cities unto themselves. They would be stockpiled with weapons and food and have a lot of people at their disposal. So if it was under siege, if it was being attacked by an outside force, they could withstand the invasion for a long period of time with all they had inside. So castles are the centerpiece, again, like I said, of a manor. Women did have a crucial role on many manors. They would often run the estate if there was a war going on and the lord was off fighting. Some women used that opportunity to become very, very powerful. This picture is of a woman named Eleanor of Aquitaine who ended up marrying King Henry II of France. So she's an example of how a noblewoman can actually gain large amounts of power by playing their cards right. Women usually could not inherit land. Land typically went to the oldest male heir. There were some exceptions if, say, the lord died and there was no living heir as far as a son goes. But typically, women still could not inherit land, even though they could, in some cases, have a great deal of power on the estate. Before marriage, women were expected to know how to do some basic domestic things like spinning and weaving, so that they could be dutiful wives and bear lots of children. Then there's the peasants. The peasants are the 99%, as it were. This is the lion's share, the vast majority of the population. Most peasants were serfs. They were not slaves. Slaves can be bought and sold and traded. Serfs weren't really treated that way, but they were bound to the land. They were essentially duty-bound to the estate on which they worked, and they were not allowed to leave without permission. That's called serfdom. It's not like slavery. Peasants did work very long hours, very arduous tasks, things like repairing roads or farming land. They would go fight if they were absolutely needed. In return for this back-breaking work, they were promised food and housing, and in some cases a small amount of land of their own so that they could farm and have crops and food for their families. Life was very harsh in medieval times, especially if you were a peasant without the luxuries of a castle life. Very rare to live beyond about the age of 35 or 40 just because of exhaustion and the rampant spread of disease that could happen among the peasant class. They didn't have very good diets. There was virtually no meat in their diet. It was often coarse bread and some vegetables they managed to grow on their own land. The only meat peasants would typically eat is if they illegally killed an animal on their lord's land. That's known as poaching, when you illegally kill an animal. That was one of the rare instances where peasants may have meat to eat. The type of work they did depended on what season it was. In the spring, they are plowing the fields and planting crops. In the summer, they're tending the fields typically. In the autumn, they are harvesting the crops. In the winter, they're probably doing something that does not involve agriculture, things like mending fences and paving roads and things like that. But a very tough life for peasants in medieval Europe. That is all for today. Coming up next, as we continue with the Middle Ages, we will talk about the medieval economy and the role of guilds and trading and all of that. And we will also talk about the role of the church in Middle Age life. Thanks for listening, and as always, ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers!